The ever talked about schoolyard discussion that swept the nation all year between if Mike Tomlin wanted to continue having non losing seasons was stronger than the toxicity of Aaron Rodgers has been answered as Rodgers won in convincing fashion with in 1 year taking the joy out of Mike Tomlin not losing, and that is pretty compelling, I would say. But in a more serious tone, Mike Tomlin is one of the most divisive figures, I would say, in sports history because despite many suggesting he has just a foolproof resume and is definitely a premier coach of his era and all time, there's a lot of things that slice into that, and the critics are very loud about it as well. So people think he's either like top 10 coach all time or actually not even good. And you don't see that very much in sports. There's generally, some sort of consensus, and I would say that for the most part, people do lean more into that Tomlin is great. But again, the critics are very loud, and I know there's no room for nuance in sports. That is one thing that is just abundantly clear, but I think we could try, maybe just a little bit, and I think we could take a look at the whole picture here, as crazy as that is to say, and see that Tomlin has been a very productive coach, and he also does have a lot of things that go against him. And, the biggest thing, I don't know if you've heard this, it's only been said about 100 trillion times this week, that is. Mike Tomlin does not have losing seasons. He's tied for second with Belichick for the longest streak of non losing seasons at 19. That is second only to Tom Landry with 21. Pretty good company there, I would say. The caveat there is non losing, not winning. So, you know, in that span, there's 3 8 and 8 seasons. That kind of, cuts into it a bit, I would say. 9 and 8, 9 7 and 1, 9 and 7, 9 6 and 1. Those aren't losing seasons, but they're not really winning seasons either. So he did definitely dabble in the 500 arts. That is abundantly clear. He did win that Super Bowl. That is something that will forever be etched in history. He got to another one, lost to Rodgers, funnily enough. So Rodgers again involved in Tomlin's history there. But, you know, there's stuff to be said about that Super Bowl. I'm not here to say that, it's Cowher's team, so it doesn't count. I think that argument is sort of wonky because Cowher didn't win with that exact team. He won, years prior, but that's not that exact team. It's not like Cowher won the Super Bowl and then Tomlin just got his. Tomlin won with that team, so there is merit to that for sure, beyond just, you still have to win it, even if someone else has. So I think that argument is pretty poor. I do think it is rather dumb to say, well, it's just somebody else's team. It's like, yeah, maybe if they won 10 Super Bowls in a row and you get the 11th, maybe there's a little bit of an asterisk there, but that's not how it was. So there is that. There is, you know, the part about 26th in regular season win percentage. I think that really does, factor in a whole lot. That's a great stat. So many would aspire for that. But yeah, that's when we look at 50 plus games, by the way. That's what PFR does. That's the distinction they make for playoffs as well, is using their method, which is 4 plus playoff games for win percentage. So 26th is great. It's not top 10, though. So, how much do you value being at least 500 compared to how much do you value outright winning? That is, fair to ponder. So I think it's also, really something to say that he's 74th in playoff win percentage. 9 straight years without a playoff win. The most recent starting quarterback they beat, the Steelers that is, was Alex Smith on the Chiefs. A fine quarterback. Matt Moore, the backup. AJ McCarron, backup. So, even when they won, there were some interesting caveats to it, They did win, really not as much as you would have liked with having the Killer Bees offense and him being a defensive guy, at least seemingly. More of, just ended up being just a culture guy for the most part. He didn't really have his, you know, blueprint for defense being too much of anything at, a great extent of his portion, but, you know, you would think that that would help some to ensure that the defense was at least competent, which in a lot of the Killer Bee years it was not. So that is something as well. I do think, there is a greater need for coaches to be X's and O guys and leave their, input in on at least one side of the ball, preferably offense, since it's been an offensive league for some time now. But, if you're a defensive guy, be a great defensive guy, like, Mike McDonald or D'Amico Ryans has been until this year, where he's no longer the play caller for defense, but still, influencing it a lot. That is something too. Mike Tomlin has about as little of a coaching tree as you'll ever see for any coach of note. It just is not there, to be honest. So, that is interesting to see compared to like a Sean McVay, who in, half the time has over double the productive coaches in the league around him. So it is interesting to see that Tomlin has had a whole bunch of coordinators, offensive and defensive, in his time, and, for one reason or another, they didn't stick anywhere, really. Bruce Arians is probably somebody that would come to mind. That's not really Tomlin thing there. That's kind of just, they overlapped. So, that's like the big one, and that's not even really something. So it is very odd to see. I'm not saying that's the be all end all, but it is very strange to see, a great coach not have a great coaching tree. It does kind of speak to, again, sort of the enigmatic part that is Tomlin, where it is a lot of the like sort of intangible things where, it's like the cultural thing as opposed to he's going to get your defense right. And, that I guess just wasn't caught by the coordinators he brought in, hence why they had no success as coaches or even really coordinators in lots of instances anywhere else. So that is a part of it too, for me at least. I do think that matters a bit because you do see it with like almost every other coach. They have, a good impact on the rest of the league, whereas that just wasn't the case with Tomlin basically ever. I think the, you know, the part about not having playoff wins, I think that does speak when you contrast it to the non-losing seasons and you also compare that to just the winning percentages. I think it speaks to the floor raising of Tomlin, but also not really the ceiling raising, which I think is what tends to be the case with culture guys. Culture guys I see of, just kind of more of like a bridge option until you can get the mastermind X's and O guys like the McVays, who I cite, a lot here, but like Kyle Shanahan, Andy Reid, others, of course, of that nature. Bill Belichick, he was kind of both, but, you know, there's, lots of them. And I think the X's and O guys do tend to be more of the ceiling raisers, but they're a little bit more erratic in the floor. department. So for me, there's no question. I want the guy to make us a championship team. I don't really care about being just competent. So, teams like the Jets, the Browns, you know, shots fired there, but, they would love to have a Tomlin to get the culture right and then, see what happens from there because they're not even really in the conversation. So, something like that, Tomlin would be loved there, would be an icon. But if your aspirations are a Super Bowl or even just being in the mix for one, that culture only takes you so far. At the end of the day, especially too with the roster control he's had a huge input over across the years, the culture is only going to take you so far. The talent and the X's and O's themselves are going to do a lot. So one thing that I don't think is at all an excuse whatsoever is, well, Tomlin just didn't have the talent to work with. At a certain point, if you're heavily involved with deciding who's in the team, be it free agent, draft, trade, what have you, and you don't have talent, who's to blame for that? That, you know, being one of the most relevant coach decision makers for roster choices in history, easily. Belichick being the GM and the coach, that is, the tier one, but Tomlin is not far behind. You mean to tell me that, even with different GMs too, that and owners, that, you know, Tomlin's words not carrying, at the utmost importance on things? Like, we all know he does have a huge role with it, but I think the extent of it can, sometimes get lost. That with Tomlin having such seniority and, the undying affection seemingly of most of Pittsburgh and a lot of, their management, what he says is treated as gospel. So, you know, things like the disastrous Pickens trade going into then DK getting an older, worse version of Pickens that actually ended up doing something worse and, punching a fan that didn't call him slurs like he lied about. Punching a fan like that being worse than anything Pickens had ever done, when DK was supposed to be, the more mild mannered version. He had a lot of controversy to come in, being a very much diva type receiver. That was on Tomlin. Maybe not 100%, but if he said no, Pickens is our guy, that's what it would have been. So, that's an example. There's so many draft picks on defensive players, low value positions in particular, like Devin Bush trading up for in the first round. Broderick Jones ended up being a disaster, even as he was moved from right tackle to left tackle, which shouldn't have made a big difference, but, he had the year there until he got hurt, and he just was bad there as well. So many things didn't pan out. They were defensive choices. They were, again, kind of floor choices where it's like, if the linebacker pans out, we have our Shazier replacement, and then, that helps the defense a bit. But, elite shutdown corner, which they really didn't have with Tomlin, was just, not in the cards. They tried it with like Artie Burns. You know, there's just so many things that were just not connecting. Jarvis Jones, another one, And yeah, they did have lots of late picks in there, but, again, that's kind of going to be par for the course when you have a floor raising coach instead of a ceiling one where, you're going to be locked into like that 20th pick. Whereas, the ceiling raiser might have you get the 12th pick one year, but he also might get you, the Super Bowl the next year. So, or, down the line. So it's kind of hard to really hold that even up into things as well. I do think a lot of the things that people defend Tomlin for are also created by him, where, again, the roster talent's not there, but he created the roster. Like, that's, partly on him at the very least. And, you know, so many of the choices he definitely was very involved in. I don't think the team would just decide to draft defensive players continually that weren't going to make a huge impact, even if they did pan out. I don't think that was an organizational thing. I think that was a defensive minded head coach trying to be defensive minded. The offense, so many years has just been like, let's play to not lose and then hope the defense does something that has not worked out at all. So, again, just a lot of floor things and not a lot of ceiling plays, which I think is really reprehensible. I think you play to win the championship, not to just win some games. So, that's my thought on it. I think Tomlin getting out now is really good, but also kind of delayed because, you know, I think the organization would have been better if, they just got into a full rebuild several years ago, honestly. They've never really competed in the past several years. Pretty much the Killer B era end was the last time. I mean, again, if you don't take my word for it, take 9 straight years without a playoff win. You need to win more than one, and they didn't even do that for 9 straight years. So, you know, I think getting into a rebuild before overpaying Watt to be kind of just like a, hey, you were great for us for a while there. Here's your money. That's pretty tough. This is a barren team. There's no doubt about it. This is one of the worst jobs to get into as a coach. You have a late pick, you have not a lot of money, and you have basically no young talent. You know, you have an okay but overpaid wide receiver one that's 28 and strictly athleticism in DK. Then you have some good tight ends in Washington, Fryermuth. That's it. And then you have a good young offensive line. That is the one thing they can feel good about, is a good young offensive line. Aside from that, it's the worst, most bare quarterback room in the league. I know Will Howard is sometimes talked about in good lights, but he was a sixth-round pick after all. You don't see too many great quarterbacks coming out of that, so that does mean a lot. I know it's nice to fantasize that, well, maybe he can be the franchise, but he's 24 years old. He's after his rookie year. You have 3 years to figure it out. And again, he went in the sixth for a reason. So that's really tough. The, you know, the young talent on the team is, again, just non existent. Every other team, basically, in the entire league has much more of it. But, Joey Porter Jr., he's ran the gauntlet at this point. He's been okay. He's been bad. He's been good. In, 3 years, he's done it all that you can in that. So who knows what year 4 is? He needs paid. This is last year. Designated pass rusher Keanu Benton. He needs paid. Breakout edge rusher Nick Herbig. He needs paid. That's it for the young talent, really, after Washington and the offensive line. So, there's some stuff there, but not stuff that you're really seeing as building blocks. Peyton Wilson was a very intriguing prospect. He was great year one, not so much this year. Queen, another overpaid dude. So this is a really horrendous situation for the future. It needs to be basically, let's compete for the number one pick, fire sale type of deal to replenish the cupboard here, because it is so bare. So I do think that factors in a lot to Tomlin's legacy, because he's done short-sighted moves that haven't panned out, and that plays a part. If we want to talk strictly coaching, he hasn't really gotten the defense to be maxed out, or the offense to be maxed out. He has instilled a culture of continually trying to get some wins, not necessarily doing so, but that's something. So there is some of that culture there, but for me, the biggest overarching cultural piece by far, no questions asked, is a lot of bad characters. And, you can argue how much of that matters, but I think for me, when you're talking 9 years without a playoff win, and you have a lot of bad character players involved that weren't even difference makers. I really question the process. James Harrison, domestic violence, really bad situation there. Michael Vick, we know the stuff he disgustingly did in the dog fighting ring. So there's that. Cam Sutton, disgusting domestic violence there. Backup Nickelback. Anyways, he was terrible in Detroit. Michael Vick was unusable, the worst quarterback we've seen in several years. James Harrison was an okay, like, third edge rusher. Jabril Peppers, another domestic violence guy there. Wasn't really, anything. Like, even still, if he's the best safety in the league, that's not going to be enough to save this defense. So, lots and lots. Those were just like off the top of my head. Lots of bad apples brought in, and there wasn't even playoff success to show for it. So, that to me is what it comes down to. The TLDR certainly is, floor raiser, ceiling. I prioritize ceilings. I don't think we're going to be too caught up in, well, they had a lot of 8-8 seasons mixed in there. That's pretty good. At least they never went like 4-12 and then use that 4-12 season to get a Super Bowl in addition to the one he already had. So you know this is a new day in Pittsburgh for sure. Maybe this does right the culture. There's a lot of iffy stuff in there with the character guys they brought in under Tomlin, the steroid stuff of the 70s as well, the concussion stuff of the 70s. You know, there's a lot of iffy parts of the history, but maybe this is a turning of the tide into a better future for them. It sure should be with the football itself, because again, this gets a new set of eyes on things, a fresh, young candidate. Hopefully they do get rid of this idea of competing now with this construction, because it's just not going to happen. There's not a chance at all. So maybe they do get into a rebuild finally. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't bring in, like the worst type of candidate, honestly, just to be like, well, you're going to get fired in a year or two anyways, when we, have some draft picks to start really figuring stuff out. Maybe that's what they do. So who's to say? They maybe, try to convince themselves that with all this spent money they have on old vets, that, are regressing in front of our very eyes. Maybe they think they can still put it together. I think that would be foolish, but, that seems to be the MO, is to just always kind of be in the mix. Not really, but like kind of. Instead of like, dear God, turning into the Browns in their own division. So, you know, there is that. Those are my thoughts on Mike Tomlin, the legacy there, what the job is looking like for the Steelers moving forward. Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are. Also, be sure to like and subscribe. Also, I have a Spotify podcast now, so be sure to look into that if you do like the podcast format. I have the YouTube channel, of course, if you're on Spotify, so there is that. Also, be sure to treat yourself like a friend, and thank you for watching.